And about the time that the talks were beginning to thaw relations between the U.S. and Cuba, Penny Clute, who is well known here in the Plattsburgh area, former district attorney and city court judge, you made a trip to the island of Cuba back in January, and this was right after all of these changes had been announced by the Obama administration.
It was, not because I was farsighted, however. It happened, I mean, I made my trip plans in October having no idea that there'd be a change, but as it turned out, January 16th was the day that I flew from Miami to Havana, was the day that the new changes took effect. So it was very cool. And so the week I was there was the same week that the first Department of State delegation came and the talks started.
So as that was announced and you were down there, what was the sense among people in Cuba?
It was very positive, very hopeful. It felt to them, it felt to me. My small group was Canadians and Americans. We all had good feeling about it. And the Cuban people were very welcoming. I think they're very much looking forward to this. Many people are. There's probably a difference of opinions.
Now, you went down there for a trip. You took a lot of pictures, which we're going to share and we're going to talk about in just a moment. But what was the purpose of your trip? Because we know that you can't go as a tourist from the United States. So was there a purpose for the trip?
Right. You cannot go as a tourist, and that's the U.S. rule, not a Cuban rule. My purpose was to take pictures. I went with a small photography group, very small, like 8 people, led by a Canadian photographer named Richard Martin, who I had taken a workshop from in Ontario and liked his approach. So when I got an email saying he was going to Cuba, I'd been kind of thinking about Cuba for a couple of years. I knew people who had gone there. So I signed up to be on a photography trip and the things that were arranged to that. And he's gone. He's a Canadian, so he gets to go a lot. He's been going for 15 years to Cuba.
So for you, it was great. Not only was this during a period of great change beginning, but also you could view that change through the lens of your camera. So where were some of the places you went, and what were some of the amazing photographs that you were able to take?
We stayed in, well, I went to 2 cities, Havana, and we stayed in the old part of the city. There's a part just called Old Havana that some of the buildings are 100, 200 years old. And we also went, that's on the northern coast, kind of the northwestern part. We also went on the kind of the south central coast to a city called Trinidad that in 2014 celebrated its 500th birthday anniversary. So it's an old city, very colorful, very different from what Havana's like. And one of the things about being a photographer and going on a photography trip is you go very slowly. You spend a lot of time, you know, walking around, looking at things, kind of soaking in what you're seeing and taking lots of pictures. I took 5,214 pictures in 10 days because we spent hours walking around, and we weren't restricted in that walking around. So some of my impressions of Havana, especially old Havana, and what I saw is I knew ahead of time that there were classic American cars there, but there were many more than I imagined. There are lots of them, and most of them are taxis. Maybe all of them are. I don't know if anybody privately owns one as their personal vehicle. So all the taxis on the street are these wonderful classic American cars. So there's lots of them. That was very cool, and we would spend a lot of time photographing them in motion or in, you know, or parked. And some are in wonderful, beautiful condition, others not so much. But another big impression of Havana, though, is that it's old Havana, is that it's decayed. The buildings, there are these lovely, big, Baroque architecture, kind of fancy buildings, not tall buildings, you know, maybe 3 stories high, 4 stories high, that they're just crumbling, they're falling apart. I guess it's 54 years of delayed maintenance to some extent, and there's not private property. I don't know if it's one of the fallouts of not having private property and private responsibility. Once the revolution happened in January 1959, everything became government property. But in Old Havana, more than other places, things are just, like I said, just falling apart. You can just see them crumbling. It's and there's no color either. Everything is kind of this gray, I don't know, concrete color or stone color.
Was that more of what jumped out at you than the beauty of the island itself? Was it the architecture? Was it the how the city seems almost trapped in time? You mentioned
in Old Havana,
since the trade embargo, they can't get American cars or parts, so they drive the 1950s vehicles, and we see so many of those on the road.
And have to be very inventive in repairing them and keeping them running. Yes, my distinct impression of the old city, of Old Havana, where I spent most of my time walking around, was that it's trapped in time but not preserved in its pristine condition. Mm-hmm. You know, that time has taken its toll. I think there's just not money to do that. There are certainly other parts of Havana where many people live and more middle-class people live that are in much better condition. It's not like every place is like that. But it's a pretty impactful to get used to, seeing how everything's falling apart.
How is it different than when you traveled to Trinidad down to the southern coast of Cuba?
Trinidad, even though it's 500 years old, so that's pretty old, is not falling apart. It's very, to our eyes, it's very picturesque. The streets are cobblestone. There are horses. There are probably more conveyances by horse than by car. There are some of the classic cars there, but not many. People ride bicycles and go in horse-drawn carts. The roofs are tile, the ceramic curved tile. So it's very pretty. It's very colorful. The walls are painted. If you walk down the street, you see a lot in any, well, certainly throughout Trinidad and certainly parts of Havana as well. What you see from the street part is just a plain wall. If you go in the doorway, if you're invited in, you get to go in the doorway, you see that there's courtyard, there's much more inside. But so in Havana, those walls usually weren't painted. But there might be storefronts in Havana, but some of them are in terrible shape. And the new ones, the new privately owned ones, are in very good shape. But anyway, in Trinidad, almost everything is painted very colorfully and tastefully. And there's a whole variety of colors you'll see in the pictures I took. It's very, very different.
What were some of your favorite pictures?
Well, I think some of my favorite pictures are of people. And I'm not used to taking pictures of people. The kinds of pictures that I've taken mostly in the past are landscapes. I go out west, or I go places with big landscapes that are very stunning. And those were the first workshops and lessons I took. I'm not used to taking pictures of people, and I feel kind of intrusive at times asking people if I can take their picture. But that was part of what this was about. You walk around the street, and if you see people, you ask to take their picture, so you got more used to doing that. One of the many benefits of going with a group, not just as a tourist, since you can't even go as a tourist, so I went with a group, and particularly a photography group, is that we had access to opportunities that I wouldn't have, even if I were on my own. For example, we went to a ballet school, and were able to spend a couple of hours while the students did whatever their normal training and workouts were. And there was a group of young girls and a group of older girls, and we could just be there taking pictures all the time. We went to a boxing gymnasium. Same thing, we're there for a couple of hours. We can get, with the boxing, we could get right close to them even. With the ballet, they're dancing on a floor and we're around the edge, but you're still pretty close. But went to the boxing gym. And so you really, like I said, you slow down. So you're a couple of hours with the same subjects, really, and you take probably hundreds of pictures as they're moving and you're moving around. And so it was nice, and I enjoyed enjoyed that interaction. We also went to a dance company that is a professional dance company. It's an Afro-Cuban percussion dance, at least the way, and they put on a dance, but they let us be right, which is what they do all the time. They have a little studio, and we could be right there taking pictures. And we met, our guide and our leader met a Cuban photographer who offered to, or arranged to have a ballerina pose for us in a mansion of a woman that he knows. And so we, again, had an opportunity, an hour and a half, 2 hours. So those things stand out most, but within those, the smiles of the people, especially the young girls, I think the girls in the dance school, because it seemed unusual experience for them to have photographers there. So they were kind of, you know, looking around and would be smiling at us, and there were times where I got to be able to be closer up and take their pictures, and it was a connection, and a very warm, positive one.
Was that eye-opening? Were you somewhat surprised by how warm and receptive the people were?
I think I was. I think I didn't have any preconceptions, really. I hadn't really thought about that. The only thing I thought about was, oh, there's going to be cars there. You know? So I didn't really know what to expect, but it was beyond anything that I would have expected, I think. Yeah, it was very nice.
And again, this had just been announced that the U.S. and Cuba were going to just begin to normalize relations, so folks didn't have a lot of opportunity to digest it. But did you get the sense from the people there that this is truly something that they're looking forward to, and that they see that it may economically be a benefit to them down the road? I
didn't talk to a lot of people, but through our guide who works for the Cuban government, all guides do, but has also worked with Richard Martin, our photographer, for 5 years. So he was very comfortable with us, answered all kinds of questions, and so we could ask him, you know, his own views and what the Cuban people, you know, he portrayed it as being very positive. Often when we'd walk around and start talking to people, people would ask where we're from, and we were a mixture of Canadian and American. So I guess they're used to Canadian. I learned that they have the highest number of tourists, so they're used to Canadians. But they got a positive reaction. But then when any of us would say from USA or America, there were big smiles. It was very, very positive. At the same time, one thing that really struck me, when we took the bus to Trinidad, so we come out of Havana, there's highway that goes to Trinidad, pretty empty highway. There's not many vehicles around, because I think people don't own vehicles. But there were billboards up. To me, they looked like new billboards. And I say that, you know, given that it's the week where they're starting the discussions with the U.S., there were billboards. I've got some pictures of them, too. There's one with what we call the embargo, they call the blockade. There's one with a giant fist striking Uncle Sam, who's being knocked out, and there's the word, the blockade.
Yeah.
There's another with that has blockade in white letters on a black background, and then a noose. And within the noose is the island of Cuba. And in Spanish, I had to ask our guide what it said. In Spanish, it said, the blockade, the longest genocide in history. I mean, that's strong language, yeah, and very negative language. And they didn't look weathered, these billboards. So at the same time, the propaganda is still very, I don't know if it's that's not, I suppose that's certainly anti-blockade, anti-embargo, whether it's also anti-US.
Well, as we heard
open to discussion
last week when the flag was raised at the embassy, I mean, you hear Secretary of State Kerry talking, you hear some of the top Cuban officials talking, and obviously there's still a long ways to go. There's a lot of blame for the U.S. on the part of Cuba, and so it looks, you know, the whole question of human rights and how they treat dissidents and propaganda and all that. So it seems like there's quite a long ways to go to normalize relations. And of course, the trade embargo still firmly in place, and no indication whether Congress is in any mood to lift that.
Right, the indication seemed that it's not, but it's,
and you didn't, in your discussions with the people, that wasn't foremost in the discussion about how the embargo is continuing to affect them and U.S.-Canadian or U.S.-Cuban relations.
Well, yes, in a sense, yes. The embargo is perceived as being, the embargo is blamed by the government as the reason why there's a shortage of everything, why things go wrong. It's the U.S. fault and the embargo, which just makes me wonder, how, you know, how is Raul, what's his plan here? How is Raul Castro going to deal with once that's removed, and the evil U.S. isn't the reason? The country has no money. I mean, it appears that there's really no money. The standard of living is very low. It's a very educated people. I mean, I learned, particularly from the guide, but then some books I read after that, well, education and health care have been emphasized and have been free since the 1959 revolution, including education through college and doctors, you know, professional school. So many people have college education. It's a very educated society, but it's a communist country. So the salary is the same whether you're a doctor or you're a factory worker or a farmer. It's like $23 a month or something.
Did you see a lot of poverty?
Well, you see, I mean, from what when we went to it's not the poverty like we would think of in our slums. It didn't seem that dramatic. There is much that is, you know, there's a basic standard that is provided to everyone, of food, of housing, of health care. You know, health care and education, more than we have, is available and used by everyone. As are arts and sports. When we went to the gym, the boxing gym and the ballet school, every child, everyone can take part in these things for no cost. We went, when we took the bus to Trinidad, we then also went out in the, we go through what they call the countryside, very rural, pastoral parts. And we also went farther out into the countryside from Trinidad. There, I mean, it's certainly very rudimentary to our eye, you know, horse-drawn plows. I mean, some of what we're going back to, I guess, with some of the, but that's a very fair question, but it's hard to answer because I think there's not that poverty because there is this safety net. This whole table is, everybody is at this level. The more the challenge is, how do you improve your status? When you are educated, when you have ambition, how can you have more things? When I first started noticing the billboards and the propaganda and the signs about revolution, and I was taking pictures of them, I started thinking about, you know, these are the only signs I'm seeing. And it's not like it's everywhere. It's not like constantly, but you know, on every wall or anything. But there are signs about Viva Fidel, and there's pictures of Che Guevara many places. There's not many of either Castro, but there's much of Che, and references to the revolution. So then I'm realizing there's not any other kind of signs. Well, then the next thought, well, there's nothing to buy. There's not advertising. The advertising is the revolution, reminding you of the revolution and the, you know, kind of the values of the revolution and the reason why the Cuban people are what they are.
When you talk to the people, do they talk openly about their hope that the normalization of relations between the U.S. and Cuba may improve their lives or give them something they don't have now?
Yes, I didn't talk to that many people. I mean, I had opportunities to take people's pictures, but not a whole lot of opportunity to have a conversation, except with our guide. But so yes, casually. I would say that yes, casual. Yes, there definitely is that hope, and there's the hope, and I think maybe even the expectation, but certainly the hope that there can be a blend of a more capitalist. They don't use. I'm putting in some words. I'm trying, to try to explain
they
to
don't
you.
Use that,
but certainly they have real values that that hopefully they will be able to keep and not be overrun by our commercialism and a consumer kind of society. But at the same time, they can have a balance, a better balance than we have found.
Did you get the sense they would like to see more tourism, more American tourists coming?
Absolutely. And one is a very practical reason is that only, it seems, if I'm interpreting this correctly or understanding this correctly, the people, I said before about how it's very difficult to raise your standard of living because everybody gets the same pay. The only people who can get something more are those who are in the tourist industry because they get tips. So they might have the same salary, but they have the opportunity to see foreign tourists and to have tips, and therefore they have the money to be able to buy something. There's not something there to buy, but they can choose things that their relatives can bring in. And that's how it's been. That's working within the structures that there are now. They would, if they want to watch, if they would like something and can pay for it, then they could select something and a visiting Cuban American relative can bring it. TVs. I mean, all those things are coming in now, last few years. That's one of the things that President Obama changed early in the presidency. But that's how people get whatever products they have.
You mentioned the Canadians. There have been no restrictions on Canadians traveling there for years. There's been no trade embargo. And so it's a very popular destination for Canadians from Montreal, Quebec, all across Canada. And they go to the beaches there, and many of them go there to vacation.
Yes. I hadn't realized that. I just live in my own bubble, I guess. But I definitely learned that. And there are a number of all-inclusive beaches. There's one called Veradero that there's direct flights from Toronto. That's just an hour and a half west, I think, of Havana. So my impression is that most tourists that exist now from Canada or from Europe, a large proportion go to the beaches. They don't necessarily go to Havana and to some of the other locations, but they do go to the beaches. Trinidad is not right on the ocean, but it's very close to it. It's like a 15-minute bus ride or something. And there are all-inclusive resorts there too. A lot of Germans apparently come to these beaches as well. In Trinidad, you asked about our accommodations. There's only a couple of hotels, and they were full. When they tried to make reservations for us a year ago, they were full. But we stayed in essentially what would be a bed and breakfast. Like a little, I think they call them hostels, but they're not what we would think of as a youth hostel. They're more what we would think of as a bed and breakfast. A family with, who has rooms and can provide breakfast or other meals. And that was very nice. And as we walked around, and so that was nice to be with regular people too. And I noticed, you were talking about tourism, I noticed that there's a sign, it's kind of like half an anchor on many doors that I learned indicated that it was a hostel, that there were rooms for rent there. So there's quite a bit of that in Trinidad. I don't really know anything more about Trinidad than I walked around to see. I'm kind of wondering whether the 500th anniversary last year brought paint and improvements, or if it's been in good shape for a long time. I mean, it didn't look like something that had been remodeled. But a lot of the paint looked new, but not all of it. But I think for whatever reason, it's in better condition. Certainly the population pressure isn't nearly what it is in Havana. Havana has a great many people in it.
Many of the changes, some of the changes being talked about include allowing Americans to spend money there, use their credit cards, which they can't do now. And so with the possible lifting of a number of restrictions for American tourists. We're seeing charter flights from Miami now. JetBlue is talking about flights from JFK, or already started flights from JFK. Even Plattsburgh talking about the possibility of people from Montreal coming down and taking flights directly to Cuba from Plattsburgh International Airport. So we're seeing an era where many people are hopeful that not only for Canadians but also Americans, that more tourists will be able to go down there. Would you like to go back as a tourist? You'll probably take your camera with you because you always do, but would you like to go back in maybe in a few years and see how some of the changes have taken place?
I would, yes, I'm interested in that, but before they can handle very many tourists, there needs to be a lot more infrastructure there. They are not, I don't think they're in any shape to have a huge leap in their tourism in terms of just water, electricity, rooms. There's even at like I said, our hostel was very nice. We learned by experience that apparently the water shut off at night till about 7 in the morning. Well, we would be getting up before 7 and want to take a shower or use the toilet. There's no water.
Really?
But then it was on. So we figured, oh, it must come back on somewhere, because we would go out to shoot pictures for a couple hours and come back for breakfast around 9, and then there was water. So I think our timing was just, didn't realize their timing. Mm-hmm. But there's limited capacity, and there's limited good hotel room capacity for what a tourist would be interested in. The other thing I noticed about Havana is the air is terrible. There's all these
air quality.
Yeah, air quality. The buses, there are buses, they're Chinese buses apparently, Chinese manufactured, and the classic American cars are all diesel. So the cars have all been converted to diesel because diesel was cheaper. Mm-hmm. But the fumes are awful. So we'd go out on the streets and walk around to take pictures. By the time, for about 2 hours, I'd be choking by the end of that period come in. It's really pretty bad. I wonder what the asthma incidence is there. Yeah, so it's not all wonderful by any means, but it's very interesting and I think a very positive change.
So change would probably have to come somewhat slowly.
Yeah, there needs to be investment. Now maybe that's, I have no idea what they're talking about or how they're going to do it. I know that Marriott announced early, right away in December after President Obama and Raul Castro announced that they're going to start making changes. Marriott said they were interested. How they're going to work out with the Cuban government about who owns the hotel they build.
Right.
Cuban government needs somebody else to come in and
right.
build the infrastructure.
And whether
then
the hotels,
who's going to be the owner of it?
And whether the hotels have to wait for the trade embargo to be lifted before they can open, I'm not sure.
Right. Can they bring in materials? Yeah, those answers, I don't know. Those are real issues. I guess what I'm saying, there needs to be that investment though before there can really be a significant increase in tourism.
Well, then that was what great timing that you chose to go. I mean, it must have been wonderful to go. You'd never been there and to see the island, but how fortunate that you went at that time to see it during the beginning of this period of change.
Yeah, it does. It really felt to me then, and still does. It's really on the cusp of change. Whether it'll probably be slower than we're thinking, but that's a new revolution, really. There really is huge change coming.
And I asked you about your favorite photographs. In Havana, was there anything about the city that you liked the most, as far as what you were taking pictures of or places you visited?
The people, number one. Second was that although much of the city is drab, kind of decaying and drab, there are areas of art and colorful murals. There's one whole kind of short street called Callejón de Gemel, I think. It's a several walls, like half a block long, several walls of Cuban African art. And that's such a pleasant, they took us there on purpose, but it's really a treat. It's very vivid color. Sometimes you'd just be walking along the street and the doors would often be open to whatever the entrance, there wouldn't be a room right there, but it would be an entrance to a courtyard or to a stairwell. And sometimes they'd be all painted. There'd be a artist upstairs and just very, very vivid colors. So that was a treat.
And other than Chateauguay, just to discuss that, have you shown your pictures to groups and have they been surprised by what they saw? Do people have a lot of preconceived notions about what life is like in Cuba?
I think most people have what I have, kind of a blank, rather than a preconception of it must be like X, Y, or Z. I have shown pictures in a couple of ways. I have this kind of moving picture video, this half-hour video that I put together that I've shown at some senior centers. It's going to be at a library in Essex. I'm trying to think of where else. Several different places, and I've also printed up some of the photographs. I had a show in Keysville recently of a variety of my photographs. About half of them were from Cuba, and there was definitely a lot of comment. And they were both. I had a mixture of some of the people ones, the dancers, the boxers, and some just more in Trinidad. They're the more colorful, more textural Trinidad walls and roofs and things. And yeah, a lot of interest, a lot of positive, and the cars, of course. I printed up some of the cars, so they get lots of attention.
And that's the image that so many people have, or these 1950s cars on the streets of Havana. Good. Well, Penny Clute, thank you very much for taking the time to come in and talk with us. We appreciate it.
You're welcome. It was a very, very enjoyable experience, and I'm liking sharing it with people. So.
We appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome.